Psalter. Hear the word of the Lord. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. The Lord is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. There are glad songs of victory in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord is exalted. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. I shall not die, but I shall live, and recount the deeds of the Lord. The Lord has punished me severely, but he did not give me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me and have become my salvation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Amen.
Early in the morning of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. She ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple left to go to the tomb. They were running together, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and was the first to arrive at the tomb. Bending down to take a look, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he didn't go in. Following him, Simon Peter entered the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying there. He also saw the face cloth that had been on Jesus' head. It wasn't with the other cloths, but was rolled up in its own place. Then the other disciple, the one who arrived at the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They didn't yet understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to the place where they were staying. Mary stood outside near the tomb, and she was crying. As she cried, she bent down to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels, dressed in white, seated where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and one at the foot. The angels asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" And she replied, "They have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." As soon as she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" And thinking he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." Then Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Don't hold on to me, for I haven't yet gone up to my Father. Go to my brothers and sisters and tell them, I'm going up to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." So Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he said to her. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. While it was still dark, while it was still night, while she could not see, while she thought that death held sway, while she grieved, while she wept, while it was still dark, that's when resurrection began. We think of Easter, don't we, with images of light, not darkness. The pictures are all of sunshine, pastel colors, and lightness, streams of glory like our beautiful new banner. For the most part, our clothing is light, even when we live in Minnesota and it snowed just yesterday. And we're surrounded by gorgeous blooming flowers like in a garden. All these flowers bloom in the light, of course, not in darkness. And besides, the light is lasting us longer these days with the change just a few weeks ago to daylight savings time. It's all about light. But friends, the Easter event happened while it was still dark. And that's how I can be filled with hope this year. Since Christmas time in this church, we have hosted almost as many funerals or memorial services as we did in all of the previous year. We have mourned the deaths and celebrated the lives of far too many members and friends of this congregation. Our families and our whole family of faith is grieving, and it makes Easter all the more poignant this year. How do we celebrate resurrection when we're so aware of death right here in our doorstep? How is it to rejoice in the risen Christ when we grieve the loss of so many of our loved ones? When your grandpa is no longer at his place at the head of the table, when your beloved spouse isn't next to you sharing that hymnal today, when the laughter in your house is a little less bright and the stories just a little more subdued. Grief is a hard place to be, and it has darkness to it. And beyond grief, there's plenty of other darkness to go around. There are children gunned down in their schools, or dying in refugee camps, or hungry right here in our very own community. Politicians call each other names and argue as if that were their only job. And our own government disappoints us at almost every turn, and we despair of any return to civility, much less justice. And we live from paycheck to paycheck, or we wonder where the next meal will come from, or we struggle to find work that holds any meaning at all. So we numb the pain With drugs and alcohol, we pretend that it's all in good fun, and we face the next treatment with resignation, and we hide our fear from those who love us the most. We go through the motions of life, even as we contemplate our own death, or we hasten it with poor habits and worse attitudes. Negativity, you see, becomes a very easy place in which to reside. Competing complaints among us are not only acceptable, but practically expected. And we mistrust anyone, don't we, who seem content, or God forbid, compassionate. There is darkness in our days, and the light seems very hard to see. And in the midst of so much darkness, we flail around trying to find our way. We grieve for the deaths and the sadness of those left behind, for unfinished dreams and unsaid words. We despair, I think, over the randomness of so much of our world, the futility and unfairness that brings struggle and pain to some while others are seemingly left untouched. And I freely admit that while I have my own share of darkness, I am even preaching from a position of privilege this morning because I've made it through more than 5 decades of my life without death hitting unbearably close to home. And I live in a comfortable house, and I'm grateful to be able to feed my family and keep them safe thus far. I am well aware that there are babies whose mothers exit this world just as they enter it, and parents who lose their children to cancer or to random gun violence. And there are people around the world who regularly confront death from starvation or terrorism, from war and disease and poverty, from abuse and neglect, and crime and natural disasters, and so much more. So whatever my experience of the darkness of loss might be, it's neither unique nor dramatic. It is just our human condition, right? As an 8th century Gregorian chant puts it, in the midst of life, we are in death. Wow, when is she getting to the Easter sermon, right? So we gather together this morning to celebrate the resurrection, the high point of our liturgical year as Christians. We have a brilliant trumpet and our outstanding choir. We're surrounded by these gorgeous flowers, and we sing the hymns with gusto, and we proclaim the great triumph of Christ's resurrection. All that darkness, the wilderness and somber tones of Lent, we're putting those behind us. The tomb is empty, a bright new day has dawned, the Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. I don't know about you, but I do believe those words with all my heart. And I say them as enthusiastically as I can today and any day, along with all of you. But this year I am more aware of darkness. As I continue to grieve the deaths of so many in this congregation, as we dwell truly in the darkness of our world today, I'm drawn more urgently to another aspect of the Easter narrative altogether. I'm drawn to what Frederick Buechner calls the darkness of the resurrection itself. That morning when it was hard to be sure what you were seeing. As our gospel reading from John describes it, the disciples stumbled around in the half-light on that 3rd day after Jesus' crucifixion, running here and there in their confusion. Was it an angel sitting in that unlit tomb? Were those shadows grave clothes or something else? And that stranger lingering outside, was he the gardener? And our gospel says early in the morning, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. While it was still dark. That's where Easter begins. It begins not in the light and the sun, but in the dark. when I was growing up, the key Easter fact to proclaim was that Jesus rose, physically, bodily, literally, from the dead. As long as I believed in the historicity of the resurrection, though I didn't call it that then, I was safe. Later, as an adult, I encountered other versions of the Easter narrative. The resurrection was a metaphor in these versions, not a literal historical fact, but a potent symbol of transformation or renewal or rebirth. Whether or not Jesus physically rose again didn't matter. His friends and his followers experienced his continued presence, and that was enough. The fact is, friends, the resurrection happened in total darkness. It was sometime in the pre-dawn hours of that Sunday morning that a great mystery transpired in secret. No sunlight illuminated the event, no human being witnessed it, and even now, more than 2,000 years later, no human narrative of yours or mine can contain it. It exceeds all of our attempts to pin it down, because it is a mystery that is known only to God. Whatever the resurrection was and is, physical, literal, metaphorical, symbolic, its fullness is in the dark. It lies in holy darkness, shielded from our simple human eyes. All we can know is that somehow, in an ancient tomb on a starry night, God was working in secret to bring life out of death. Somehow, in the dark, God saved the world. Now, earlier in my life, even earlier in my ministry, this ambiguity would have frustrated me to no end. Now it doesn't at all. It seems just exactly right. Because what I've learned in the process of grieving so many deaths and coming to understand so much of the darkness around us is that no story my tiny mind can contain would ever be big enough to redeem such catastrophic loss. Death and darkness, you know, can be such an abyss, such a horror, such a violation, that nothing I can understand or explain will ever make it really okay. Only a mystery as huge as the resurrection would suffice. Only my faith in God, that God will somehow complete every story that darkness interrupts, gives me solace today. Having seen darkness up close, I don't rest in certainty any longer. Certainty really isn't enough. I only rest in mystery, because my grief, my darkness, can only bear fruit in the dark. In our gospel story, Mary Magdalene sees Jesus first, because she's the one who chooses to remain in the darkness. Peter and John leave when they see the empty tomb, but Mary stays, bewildered and bereft, but she stays. As Nadia Bolz-Weber puts it, she remains present to what is real, what is actually happening. She does so even when what is real feels unbearable to her. In my own life, I'm finding it increasingly true that clarity, hope, and healing come when I'm willing to stay, when I'm willing to linger in the hard and barren places, places where the usual platitudes fall apart and the easy answers are inadequate. Because Jesus comes in the darkness, and sometimes it takes a long time to recognize him. He doesn't look the way I expect him to look. He doesn't let me cling to my old ideas of him. He disappears again just as I'm about to grab hold of him. But he does come in the dark, and he calls my name, and in that instant, I recognize myself as well as him. In a beautiful essay I read on the resurrection, theologian and writer Chris Barnes reminds me of what actually matters. The question that Easter asks of us, he says, is not, do we believe in the doctrine of the resurrection? Frankly, that's not particularly hard. Our doctrines bend easily to conform to the darkness. But what the gospel asks is not, do you believe, but instead, have you encountered the risen Christ? Have you encountered him? I believe that we all continue to struggle with darkness in our lives, the darkness that surrounds us, and the darkness of grief in your life and in mine. But in the midst of that darkness, what matters isn't actually theology. What matters is encounter. What matters is encountering the risen Jesus and finding, in the mystery of his resurrected life, the hope we need for our own lives, dark as they might be. Often it's only in retrospect, only as we look back at the gravesides of our own lives, that we find the beginnings of our new life. While it was still dark, while it was still night, while she could not see, while she thought that death held sway, while she grieved, while she wept, while it was still dark, that's when resurrection came. This Easter, may the Christ who rose in darkness lead us into new life and new light and new hope. May we know him even in the half-lit places in our lives, in the shadowy and hard things. May we dare to linger at the graveside until we hear him call our names. And may we indeed share with hope the news of God's greatest mystery of all. The Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Amen.